time, and I really loved your book. Your book is very, very dense. And for people that don't know who you are and other books that you've written, can you introduce yourself?
So, Jayne Buxton. I have been writing more or less full time for about 20 years. Um, my first book was a nonfiction book. Then I ventured into the world of novels, and I was actually in the process of writing a novel based on a true story. And I'd been working on that for about 5 years when I became obsessed, as you might be obsessed by this whole topic of food, the environment, health, how that all links together. And so I dumped the novel and started to work on this. And that's it, now it's really kind of taken over my life. Now, before I started writing, I was in business, and I was I was a management consultant, trained as an MBA. So that was all about data analysis and looking at strategies and systems. And in a funny way, although it's completely unrelated to what I do now, I think it really gave me some skills that allowed me to do what I do now. So it allowed me to sift through lots and lots of conflicting data and try and work out a story, work out the truth, and not become overwhelmed by the massive amounts of stuff that I was dealing with, So I think all pieces of a career can do that. Sometimes life's funny. It's a jigsaw, and it leads you to a certain place. But you rely on those pieces of the jigsaw to make it work at the end. Yeah.
Oh, that's very interesting to hear, because the greatest plant-based con is a really data heavy book. And I was curious what your background was and how you were able to sift through that. What I really enjoyed about your book, Jayne, is that it didn't come off as hostile towards the plant-based community. It was fact driven. I didn't get any kind of hostility. And sometimes, like, if you follow like the carnivore community or the animal based community on Instagram, there's a lot of hostility and a lot of shaming. And it was purely factual information and data driven information in your book. So was that purposeful? Did you try to?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely on purpose. And I don't feel venomous towards, any group of people, vegans or any other people eating any other way. I think it's important to maintain that respect for people and their ideas, and just to deal in the facts. And there will, I fully accept also that there would be people who would read that book, my book, and despite all the information in it, they will still not be convinced. In fact, many won't be convinced that they should change their diet, and they want to, for various personal reasons, they insist they want to eat an animal-free diet. And that's fair enough. If people make that decision with knowledge, and having considered all of the pros and cons, having considered the dangers, then you can't argue with that. They have to be allowed to do it, and they have to be encouraged to do what they want to do. What I have always objected to, and I say this in the book, is not so much the idea of plant-based diets, vegan diets, or the idea that people will want to follow them. It's the idea that you could ever prescribe those to the vast majority of the population, or that we should all be following those, that we should all be guilted into following them. It's the universality of it, which I think is wrong and dangerous.
The marketing behind it works very well.
Marketing.
Yeah. Before I dove into diets and agriculture and climate, I started watching documentaries on Netflix just like everybody else, and I was moved by those plant-based documentaries that I didn't know were heavily funded by plant-based companies. I just thought they were solo creative films, just produced by people like me that were trying to get people healthier. And I went vegan for about a week. Just because
a week?
Yeah, well, yeah, I went vegan, but then I couldn't handle it. I fell off. I was dying.
Yeah.
But the marketing and the money that's produced by these corporations that push the narrative of you can save the climate and animals are so bad and your health and heart disease and all that stuff. It's produced really well, and there's not
It
kind of
is.
there's not an argument that's equivalent unless it's coming from people like you from the other side.
Yeah, I mean, and it's not easy to put the counter argument to this massive narrative that we have. And people did say to me, "Are you sure you want to do this?" Before I started, my friends were very concerned, and they said, "You're going to get a lot of flack. There's going to be a lot of hate. It'll be difficult. You'll be ridiculed. You'll be, shouted at." Etc. You will also be rejected. I was prepared for some rejection from the media who may not want to cover the book, and all of those things did come to pass. It's true. I was ridiculed, have been ridiculed, have been the subject of terrible personal attacks. I've had misogynistic attacks on Twitter, and I've also had some radio stations decline to interview me or to cover the book because it's just not worth the hassle, in their words, okay? They don't want to offend people. But with all that said, I've also had a massively positive reception from, people like you all over the place, from readers who are so grateful that somebody is putting another point of view. From some media outlets here, one of our mainstream Good Morning television shows had me on, and I thought that was really good of them and brave of them. So lots of positive response, and I think that we've been encouraged for far too long not to talk about this. Please don't talk about it, and people are relieved that somebody is talking about it, and that maybe they can talk about it too, a little bit.
No, absolutely. How long did it take you to write this book? Because the data that you have and the interviews that you did, and it's truly astonishing how much information that you have. I'm guessing like a few years, but I don't know how long you worked on it.
I think a couple of years of the actual writing, researching, editing, and then there was a whole other year after that, sort of what we would call post-production, I guess, if it was a film, of just making sure that the tone was right, that the legal requirements had been met, that there were no legally dangerous things in there. That was quite a long process. But look, it was interesting. I got the actual contract to write it from my publisher about 2 days before lockdown.
Wow.
The first lockdown. And so I wrote most of it during those crazy COVID years where we were in and out of lockdowns and couldn't go to work and couldn't fly anywhere, and right? Yeah. So a lot of the interviews that I did by Zoom, that great new thing that we all discovered during COVID was Zoom, right? And in a way, that was a blessing. I hate to say that anything about COVID was a blessing, but if anything it was that realization that you can connect with people through your screen. You can have great, lengthy, mind-enriching conversations with them, and you don't have to fly off to the ranch or to wherever to do it. So that's how I was able to interview almost everybody. And there were, some of them were in-person interviews once things lightened up a bit, but I was saved by that technology, really.
No, it's an amazing book for people that are curious and wanting to read. What was the inspiration behind it? What made you want to go down this trail and write about the plant-based community?
Well, I had started investigating diet for my personal use, and from that perspective, and I've been thinking about that and trying, low carb and more protein for myself, because I'd noticed that's what I needed at that stage of my life, and what used to work wasn't working anymore, and I started to read so much more about the basics behind those diets. And it was having been immersed in that kind of reading and experimenting myself, that's when I started to notice that the dialogue in public, in the media, was just so contrary to what I was reading. And the more I dug, the more I realized that it was contrary. And then Game Changers came out, and that was just a whole pile of misinformation with studies flashed up on the screen, none of which supported the premise of the film, by the way. And I know you know that.
Yeah.
So it was the Game Changers. I call that the tipping point for me. It was at that point that I decided I needed to write a book, a proper book, rather than just stew about this and research about it personally, you know.
What was the hardest portion of the book? Because you covered diet, you covered climate, you covered agriculture. I mean, regenerative agriculture. What was the hardest part or portion to write?
Yeah, the hardest part, I think, were the chapters on emissions and land use and that whole set of factors. Because I think if you look at the data around nutrition, it's really quite definitive. Yeah. Certain foods have certain vitamins in them, full stop. Certain foods are more bioavailable than other foods, full stop. You can't argue with that. So that ground that I was treading in the nutrition and the health side was much easier. Even the data on saturated fats, which I have in one of the first chapters, although it is still disputed by some parties, there's a whole body of research and a whole wave of medical professionals who now understand that saturated fat is not harmful. It's not, the story about low-fat diets being better for us is just not true. So I would say that was all pretty, I felt really comfortable and happy writing those bits of the book. The reason that the environmental side is harder to write, and particularly when you get to things like land use, is that the whole field of environmental system studies has just flourished since about 2016. And it's built on a bunch of complex models. So the assertions are always made on the basis of these unfathomable models. Which no layperson would ever be able to get to the bottom of, really. So what you're doing as a layperson there is you're trying to just unpick the assumptions of the models, because that's all you can really go on. You can't look at the modeling system and the algorithms or anything like that. And that's hard. That is brain challenging work. It's really difficult as a layperson to unpick a study like that in that field and understand whether it really is robust or not. There's also the fact that there are wide areas of disagreement within that environmental discussion. So, for instance, just one aspect of it, when we talk about regenerative agriculture, there are naysayers who say, well, yeah, that's great, but you can't feed the world that way because you'd have to reduce your production of meat by X percent, you name it, 50%, 70%, whatever. There are people who will say that. There are others who are practicing it, either the Joel Salatins, the Gabe Browns of the world, many farmers in England that I spoke to, who say, no, you don't need to reduce at all. You can have higher stocking rates on the land by managing the grazing properly. So there's no reason to suggest that we would have to eat less meat. So between that argument and the other one, you have this wide range of people along the spectrum. And I do think that the science is really hard to pin down on that. And there are many arguments still to be had about exactly how much we can produce. And I was just saying to some other people I was speaking to yesterday that one of the things we really do need to start doing is listening to those who have experience on the ground. Okay? Models are fine. You can model the heck out of anything. What about if we look at the Gabe Brown's, how's he doing it?
Yeah.
Or John Cherry's farm here in the UK. How is it he's managed to produce the same by managing differently? We've got to start respecting that information and using it, and stop thinking of it as second best.
Yeah. There's also a school of thought too, which I never thought about until I started talking to people like yourself, that we're not supposed to feed the world. We're supposed to feed our communities. So
True.
if we relied on the ranches and the farmers from around our communities and help
Mm.
boost them up, then
Yeah.
things like regenerative agriculture would help, and
Yes.
we'd be able to reap those benefits. But right now, how the food system works is very complex, and I don't understand it. But we're here in America, we're getting food from Latin America, and we're sending food
Mm.
from U.S. to Canada or wherever we're sending it. To me, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
No. I think that reestablishing those links between farms and communities would be a really positive thing. And you're right. So you're feeding that community, and in different parts of the world, the food that can be produced like that will be different. It'll be, yes, there'll be animal foods in there, but there'll be different animal foods maybe. There's a lot of milk and eggs which are required in some developing countries. They haven't got the money or the resources to have the meat, but they have the milk and the eggs. So I think thinking local is absolutely the right way to go. And the problem I have is that most of these grand movements, the grand initiatives like Eat Lancet, Planetary Health Diet, they're not thinking local really. They pay lip service to it. They're thinking, here's a diet that's for everybody around the world. Planetary health diet. I mean, come on, you've got to be kidding. So we have a long way to go to sort of keep that movement in check. We're going to have to work hard at making sure that we have a counter movement, which is this grassroots, local community driven movement around food.
Talking about climate, one area that I love that you broke down in the book was the narrative around agriculture and versus transportation. There's a lot of nuance in that data that I didn't know, and you broke it down very well. Can you talk about some of that?
Yeah. So typically, people will say, oh, agriculture, livestock in particular, animal agriculture, generates more emissions than transport. And on the surface, using the best numbers that we have from the FAO, they're technically correct in the sense that agriculture is 14.5% and transport is meant to be 14%. But there's a whole host of nuance in each of those numbers, not least the fact that the number for transport only includes tailpipe emissions. It doesn't include the road building, the car building, the infrastructure that you need when you have loads of cars on the road, all of that stuff. Whereas the agriculture number includes everything. It's a life cycle number. Now, if you calculated them on the same basis, just on a direct emissions basis, the FAO says that livestock agriculture would be 5% versus the 14% for transport. So that's one way in which it's completely distorted the whole debate. But the other way is that 14% in a way misrepresents the 14.5% rather misrepresents the impact of livestock and methane from livestock because it's calculated using something called GWP 100 instead of GWP star, which many climate scientists now think is a much more accurate way of assessing the warming potential and the warming effect of different activities and foods. And that GWP 100 calculation has overstated in many countries the impact of cows by 3 to 4 times. So again, you see that's another layer of complexity that we really rarely factor in. Nobody mentions that. In fact, if you mention GWP star, you get accused of playing into the hands of the meat industry. The meat industry must love that number, GWP star, etc. In fact, the meat industry didn't come up with it. It was a climate scientist that came up with it, and he's completely neutral. So we need to really resist that accusation that this is just a convenient metric for the meat industry. It's not. It's not the case.
Yeah. The problem is those studies, get mentioned in a news article or a headline or a documentary,
Yeah.
and it sticks. And that's what people remember is like, oh, well,
Right.
animal agriculture outpaces emissions when it comes to transportation. And everyone that is in the plant-based community just sticks with that. They don't actually
Yeah.
look into anything or read else anything. And they're not supposed to. I mean, it takes a special person to want to dive into the data to understand that.
Hmm.
So it's very complex, and even comparing countries, which
Yeah.
I wasn't aware of. And so, how does the U.S. and the UK rank with other countries around the world?
Well, in terms of emissions, if the global number is 14.5%, and we know about the caveats to that, so we know that that's a misrepresentative number. It's too high. Um, in a place like the US, for instance, beef is 2% of emissions of the total pie of emissions, beef cattle. In the UK, beef and dairy cattle, I think, are 5.8%. So we are well south of that 14.5% in countries like ours. Now, I don't know the precise number, but I know, for instance, emissions are higher in Ireland, they're higher in the Netherlands, they're higher in India. So there are particular reasons to do with each country why the emissions are high. One of the reasons emissions are high, relatively speaking, in Africa, for instance, is the incredibly inefficient way that they manage livestock, because a lot of livestock is kept, but not for food. So it creates the emissions, but it doesn't get allocated to the production of the food. So you get this mismatch, and that's why emissions in some countries in Africa are very high. So each country will have its own specific emissions picture, and in some countries, yes, those emissions can be brought down by some very specific methodologies and strategies. But to blanket condemn livestock on the basis of the global a misrepresentative global number is not doing us any good, I don't think.
Do you know why we do so much experimental agriculture in Africa? I know the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation do a lot of experimental agriculture with I forget what it's called, his seeds, his fake seeds, his genetic,
Yeah.
I forget what they're called, but I know a lot of that goes on in Africa, and the news around it is all good. Everyone in Africa loves it. But then when you actually go to like an African website or an African
Mm-hmm.
blog post and people talking about it, it's completely decimating their land. But
Yeah.
but the media perception and what we get as a consumer is like, oh, everything's great. But I was
Yeah.
curious why so much experimental agriculture goes on in Africa.
Well, I think it's to do with power and money, isn't it?
Yeah.
So if you're walking around with a great big donation and you're handing it out to countries that need those donations, um, you're going to be able to have your say in how that money is spent a little bit more. And there's also the corruption element, which can't be understated in terms of where that money goes and who is persuaded to do what because of that. So I think that Africa is in a perilous position in that sense. Any underdeveloped nation is in a perilous position when faced with these massive amounts of money that come with strings attached from these foundations. I do think that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, while laudable in principle, and I also, who could look negatively on somebody who's giving away money, right? You could say that. But I do think it is close to becoming, to being a malevolent influence because of the way that money is channeled according to the specific views, it would appear, of the founders.
Yeah.
So it's not free money. It's according to a specific set of views and goals and plans.
What's astonishing too is if you look at nonprofits, pretty prominent nonprofits that are in the vegan community, even nonprofits that are on both sides of the political aisle here in America, The Bill
Yeah.
and Melinda Gates Foundation funnels money to both sides. They
Right.
funnel it everywhere. It's not just I think it's more heavily marketed in the plant-based community and the liberal community, but they do it to both sides. So they have
Okay.
this power everywhere that they can
Yeah.
pull their strings on. It's pretty wild to see.
Yeah. 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 I'm not sure, but maybe you can correct me that much of that money is going into regenerative agriculture per se, is it?
So I don't know. I know he has an the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and other companies like his are investing in land and a lot of agriculture, but I don't know where and
Yeah.
for what reason.
Yeah. Buying up land, yes, I know, but I'm not, I don't know. And I'm skeptical about whether that is for the purpose of creating a regenerative farming future.
Yeah.
I'm skeptical about that.
Yeah, like companies like General Mills and Nestle, I think, or Nestle.
They're doing some work.
Yeah, I don't know, but I don't know if it's good or bad. Like if it's going to be captured, you know what I mean, and it's going to be turned into
Absolutely.
something
And I
else.
think we have to be on guard to all of that. So I know that the General Mills initiative, for instance, has involved people like Gabe Brown and Alan and their organization, and they've spoken very positively about the impact. So watch this space. Let's hope that continues to be the case. There's always that possibility, isn't there, for it to flip and for there to be a double-edged sword, really.
Absolutely. I'm curious what your diet looks like on a daily basis. What kind of foods are you consuming?
What am I eating on a daily basis,
Yeah,
did you
yeah,
say?
yeah. What does your diet look like?
Well, oh gosh, you're going to really shame me now,
No.
probably, because in principle, I'm a low carb, real food advocate, and I practice that in my diet daily. So I will have mostly low carb stuff, no bread, no pasta, no cakes, no whatever, most of the time. But bread is a weakness, so every now and again I cave and I'll have some toast with my avocado. And if I'm having a family celebration, like I've got this weekend a house full of kids and it's somebody's birthday, kids, they're all almost 30, but somebody's birthday, and we will have pasta one night. One of the nights we're together, and we'll probably have ice cream one night too.
Yeah.
And so I try not to be puritanical, but I believe wholeheartedly in the benefits of that low carb way of eating. I've seen the research. I know it's best for us. I know that avoiding glucose spikes should be our goal for all of us, but we're not perfect, are we? So sometimes you eat something you shouldn't eat.
Yeah. No, I agree. I was starting to identify as an animal-based person
Yeah.
when people ask me, but then I would have a bowl of ice cream or
Yeah.
a cake, and I felt like, oh man, I can't. I hope no one snaps a picture of me right now and people see this
Yeah.
because then I'd be called out. But so I moved. I don't want to identify as something because I feel like I'd be boxing in. But I agree with you. I think whole foods, even vegetables, can be good for you. But
Yeah. Even vegetables. I love that. I love that. Eat
What-
some vegetables if you want. Yeah.
I think so. Like, isn't that
Yeah.
wild? Like people think that vegetables are bad. I think vegetables can be bad if they're heavily covered in pesticides and things like that. But if you're growing them at your house and you know what you're doing,
Yeah.
and it's not produced in a big factory, I think it's better than those
Yeah.
heavily pesticides that get covered in them.
And I think that, depending on your own tolerance and the vegetables you're eating, as you're saying, and your own genetic makeup and everything, you could do well on certain vegetables or you can do very poorly. So, Sally Norton's book, Toxic Superfoods, if you haven't read that, you should read that.
Okay.
It's great. So she talks about the dangers of overloading on certain oxalate-rich foods, spinach being one, nuts being another, so almonds, for instance. And some people will get away with it, and others will have absolutely chronic pain or chronic digestive problems because of it. So we need to take responsibility for ourselves and really watch what happens to our body when we put certain foods into it.
Yeah.
Because probably 80% or 90% of the way we feel and the way we operate in physical terms is driven by what we're eating.
Right.
You know?
The damn almond milk got me for like 3 years.
Oh,
It got me. I was a believer. I was like, oh, this is better for you. This is cleaner. This has more
yeah.
protein. It's not as bad. And once I started educating myself on it, I was like,
Yeah.
God, I'm such an idiot. I just fell for this.
The whole almond story really makes me laugh and be frustrated at the same time. So we have almonds, and we have, say, 100 grams of meat. Okay, beef. And we're being encouraged to eat the almonds instead of the beef. You know, these diets, nuts and seeds, right? Everybody wants us to eat nuts and seeds. So we're supposed to have a handful of those every day. Well, the almonds take more water than that beef, and it's blue water. It's irrigated water most of the time. The almonds also give you a pile of oxalates that if you eat a pile of them every day, you could have a big problem. So it's no better for the environment, and certainly not in water use terms, and it's probably going to be harmful to your body or to a lot of people. And yet we're encouraging people to move from one to the other. I think it's absolutely insane that these grand diets that are being designed for us do not acknowledge these very real issues. They just don't.
The blue water and green water. Can you talk about that a little bit? I'm glad you brought that up, because that is an argument that always gets mentioned from the plant-based community, is that animals require much more water than than plants and vegetables do.
Yeah. So the reason for that is that the calculation of the amount of water that goes into raising a cow, for instance, always includes what's called green water, which is rainwater. Now, that's about 95% of the water that is consumed by cattle that are raised on grass, such as most of the cattle in the UK, for instance. It's 95% green water. Now, that green water would be falling, because it's rain, it would be falling on the grass whether the cows were there or not, or whether the sheep were there or not. What's happening is it is falling on the land on which these cattle sit, and that is being turned, they eat the grass, they consume the water in that sense, and they turn it into protein. Now, if they weren't there, that water would fall and be wasted in all likelihood, because the land can't be used to grow crops necessarily. About 2/3 of our land cannot be used for crops. So it's not as if you could grow alfalfa and have it irrigated by, or grow, corn and have it irrigated by this rainwater. It would be wasted, right? So that whole green water, blue water, again, it differs by country, it differs by production system, and we shouldn't be talking about it in that generic sense. But even the people who produce the original number, the Water Footprint Network, they produce that number, which is, I think, 15,000 liters of water for a kilogram of beef. They do acknowledge that most of that's green water. So
yeah, well, because I mean, if I think about ranches here in Texas, they have ponds or water holes that most of the cattle drink from, and those are created by green water.
Yes.
These ranches do have blue water troughs on the ranch, but by and large, just the ranches that I've been on, these cows are consuming water from these natural or even man-made water holes.
Yeah. And I guess there is an argument that says, okay, and most of the water that is consumed via the crops that cattle eat when they're in feedlots. So that is a particularly water-heavy form of the beef.
Yeah.
So there is arguably a case to be made for reducing that, and for allowing more cattle to be raised entirely on pasture, or more on pasture than currently is the case.
In your research that you did for the book, comparing the US and the UK or even other countries, What country would you think is kind of leading the way for sustainable agriculture as a whole? Whether you want to call it sustainable or regenerative, which country is, kind of the most prominent one?
Wow, that's a really interesting question. And I'm going to say I don't know the answer, but what I will say is that within each country, there are examples of the best and examples of the worst.
Mm.
So in America, you've got the most vocal and active regenerative farming community. You probably also have the worst example of feedlots to the extent that they exist. Those horribly big brown bare earth feedlots where cows never see a blade of grass. So you get the best and the worst in that country. In the UK, we don't tend to have those big feedlot type things. That's just not the way it works here. So we do have most of our cattle on grass, most of our sheep, all of our sheep on grass. And so in that sense, you could say that we're a really great example in the UK, generally speaking. But I do know from people who work with farmers here that the truly regenerative farming community within the UK would probably only represent about 5 to 10% of the community.
Oh, wow.
So we still, although farming in general is to a very high standard, and it's acknowledged to be low antibiotic use, low grain input, good use of land because our land is very well suited to it, good animal welfare. Although those things are all terribly positive, we still have a long way to go before we're implementing all the truly regenerative principles for building soil health that, of course, you've been researching and all about. That's a whole different ball game, as it were.
Yeah. What's the government perception like? I feel like the government here in the U.S. is slowly starting to even talk about regenerative agriculture, but I'm not sure about what the landscape in the UK looks like.
Yeah. Well, I think that there's a surface-like appreciation of what needs to be done in government, and you'll get certain government ministers using words like regenerative. But I don't think the understanding is terribly deep, and I don't think that the government is putting the money where their mouth is. So we have something here which has just been introduced called the Sustainable Farming Initiative. And there are incentives paid through that initiative to farmers who do certain things well, like building the hedgerows so they can create channels for the wildlife, to corridors for the wildlife, or cover cropping to help replenish soil and to stop flooding. So there are all these things being encouraged. What I don't see is much mention of the role of livestock in helping that process, in helping the ground to recover, while providing food security. And I don't see the payments being enough to help farmers really do it and make a living out of it. So a lot of the farming community has been critical of those plans because the incentives aren't really incentives. They're not good enough.
I'm ignorant when it comes to the farm bill here in America, but I've read that farmers get paid to produce the monoculture crops like corn and other things, regardless if they produce or not. So it's difficult for farmers to transition to a regenerative type practice or style ranching because of the money and the incentives that gets provided. So in my head, it's almost like we're not going to see a real shift until the government starts promoting and backing sustainable agriculture.
Yeah, and until the subsidy system is shifted away. And that's hard. There'll be a lot of lobbying around that to prevent that happening, won't there?
Yeah, no, absolutely.
That would be really difficult.
Yeah, no, it's a wild time. Well, Jayne, we're at an hour, and I want to respect your time. I appreciate everything that we've been able to talk about. I love your book. How can people follow you on social media and things like that?
Well, I'm on Twitter at Jayne Buxton. and that's where I can find my debates to there, because I found I have to keep it all in one place. I don't do it on Instagram. I'm not on Facebook. I'm not on LinkedIn. It's all too much that. So if somebody wants to get in touch with me and they want to ask a question or friendly, they can send me a direct message. If they're nasty and rude, I won't answer. I'll get rid of it. So that, you have to have these rules on social media that allow you to survive, really, and allow you to stay sane. And so that's what I do. Anybody that is aggressive or rude, I'm just not going to engage with.
Yeah, that's smart. And the book's now available in the US too.
It is. Thank goodness. Yeah.
Right. Well, Jayne, I appreciate the work you do, and I'll definitely be in touch with you. Like I said at the beginning in our discussion, I'll send you the stuff. That way you can have a glance, and maybe you could provide some feedback and provide some names from the UK that I can incorporate in this documentary.
I will. Okay.
Awesome.
Nice to talk to you.
Thank you so much, Jayne. I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Take care.